More than 500 days after the Israel-Hamas conflict began, where does the Gaza ceasefire deal stand? And how is the conflict impacting the wider region? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu. This is The Heat. On Wednesday, Hamas proposed the release of all remaining hostages in Gaza as part of phase 2 of its ceasefire deal with Israel. This in exchange for a permanent truce and a complete Israeli withdrawal from the territory. Earlier this week, the movement announced 6 Israeli hostages would be freed on Saturday and the bodies of 4 deceased captives returned on Thursday. To discuss the latest there, let's bring in our guest. Joining us from London, Yossi Mekelberg is a senior consulting fellow with the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House. Here in Washington, D.C., Nabeel Khoury is a former U.S. diplomat and Middle East expert. In the studio with me, William Lawrence is a professor of political science and international affairs at American University and the area studies director at the National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations. And from Toronto, we're joined by Muhannad Ayyash. He is a policy analyst at Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network, and professor of sociology at Mount Royal University. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Muhannad Ayyash, let me start with you. Let's talk about the current status of the ceasefire in Gaza. It's been in place now for several weeks. The Israelis are still attacking targets, Palestinians in Gaza, and are preventing some of them from moving north to their demolished homes in the north. What is your assessment of what this area is now undergoing? What's the status of the ceasefire?
Thank you for having me. It still remains tenuous. The Israeli authorities have not held up to their end of the bargain. According to Al Jazeera yesterday, it's estimated that the Israelis have violated the ceasefire over 260 times. At least 132 Palestinians have been killed since January 19th. We all know that they are not letting in much needed humanitarian aid in the scope that is needed at the moment. Mobile homes are not being allowed in. Essentially, there's been a delay, of course, an extension or a delay in the negotiations over the second phase. There's reports that Netanyahu wants to basically stay in phase 1 for an extended period of time to get all the captives back before relaunching the war. But overall, the ceasefire has not led to a building of relationships of trust, certainly, to say the least. And what lies ahead is still quite murky. We know all about the Trump and Netanyahu plan to evacuate the Palestinians, but really what they're saying is to permanently expel them. So things are still very, very difficult for the Palestinians in Gaza on the ground. While Israel continues to, move forward with its project of making the Strip uninhabitable for the Palestinians.
Muhannad, just to clarify something, you say that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel wants to stay in phase 1 of the ceasefire agreement. What exactly is phase 1? I mean, phase 1, at what point does it move on to phase 2?
Well, the critical part of phase 2 is that you start to talk about the permanency of the ceasefire and Hamas's role in the Gaza Strip moving forward. This is a conversation that Netanyahu does not want to have with Hamas because he's on record saying that there can never be a Hamas-run governing authority in the Gaza Strip. So he's basically trying to extend this phase 1 as long as possible to get more hostages released and still not give any compromise on the question of Hamas's role in the Strip moving forward. So this is what essentially I mean by that, is that he's trying to delay as much as possible the question of a permanent ceasefire and the end of this genocidal operation.
Yossi Mekelberg, we've just heard in the past few hours from Al Jazeera English that the Israelis will release 800 Palestinians in return for 6 living hostages. Those releases expected to take place in the coming days. But getting back to what Hamas is proposing for the second phase, which is a total withdrawal of all Israeli occupation forces from Gaza, as well as a permanent ceasefire, is that likely?
Good evening. Probably not. And I think definitely on the Israeli side, from the beginning, there were doubts if they want to continue to phase two. This is the phase that Hamas is more interested in ending the war. It seems that the Israeli government is not. And Netanyahu keeps saying that the war won't stop until Hamas is completely eliminated, something they hasn't managed to do in the last 16 months. I think that, in a way, this ceasefire holds. It's a very fragile one, but the basic tenets of this agreement are actually fulfilled by the side, though both of them are violating, not necessarily sometimes the conditions themselves, but sometimes and most of the time the spirit of a ceasefire or a truce that should lead to a permanent ceasefire, and that's what we see. Obviously, tomorrow is going to be in Israel a difficult day when some of the sisters are returning, especially the Bibis family, mother and 2 very young children, and I think this will make it even more difficult.
Right, and Yossi, do you expect the Prime Minister to come under even more pressure domestically in Israel to resolve this, the release of the captives?
I think he is pressures from 3 directions. First, the majority of Israelis for months demand this ceasefire and the release of hostages, and we know there were at least from those who were in the negotiations, there were at least 2 windows of opportunity in March and in July, which Netanyahu, because of the pressure from the right-wing member of the coalition, delayed and derailed. So this is a set of pressure within Israel for those who would like to see the ceasefire, want to see all the hostages, and actually wanted to see it in one stroke, not having this prolonged torture of every week, 3 or 4 or 5 or 6. And then the right wing, one right wing party already left the coalition, and Netanyahu is a very slim majority in the Knesset. Then comes, of course, the Trump factor, which is confusing and incoherent. On the one hand, he's the one that pushed in the first place to the Israeli government to agree to this ceasefire, right. But then he talks about the forced removal of all Palestinians from Gaza. So then what's the point in phase 2 and phase 3 from both sides? So I think we need clarification there.
Nabeel Khoury, what is your view on the American role in what is going on right now? Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu did meet with the new United States Secretary of State Marco Rubio. That was just a few days ago. And as far as weapons transfers are concerned, President Trump has said that the weapons will continue to flow to Israel. And besides the idea of evacuating, expelling all Palestinians from the Gaza and turning into what the president called a Riviera of the Middle East, what role is the U.S. playing right now?
Well, I have maintained since the beginning of the Israeli assault on Gaza, so October 8th onward, that this was never about the release of the hostages. For sure, the families of those hostages want them back, but Netanyahu has not shown that he cares very much about them. To some extent, one of the important goals has been the total elimination of Hamas, but there has been a Trump-Netanyahu project at play even before Trump returned to the White House. And that project calls for the total displacement of the Palestinian population to wherever they can displace them to, and then a major reconstruction of Gaza which would be funded via investments from oil-rich Gulf countries. And the beneficiaries would be Donald Trump, his family, and his billionaire friends in terms of taking the contracts for the reconstruction. So this plan obviously has no place, not just for Hamas, but for any Palestinian to remain on Gaza. And the American role, unfortunately, has been to propagate this idea and to actually start planning for it. This was very much in the discussion when Rubio went to Tel Aviv and met Netanyahu.
William Lawrence, great to have you with us. Welcome to the show. Before I get into some of the specifics, what is your overall assessment of where things stand right now in this conflict? There is a ceasefire in place. The level of violence has dropped considerably. It's not completely eliminated, but it's dropped considerably. So where do things stand right now?
So the phase one ceasefire, despite over 200 violations on the Israeli side and a much smaller number of violations on the Hamas side, is holding. It's not at the right tempo, and we had moments where it looked like it might fall apart, but it's proceeding apace. I agree with most of the analysis that I heard, but I would add that Netanyahu not only didn't prioritize the hostages and probably is responsible for killing 30 or 40 of them, because now we're talking about body bags being exchanged for prisoners, but he also wants to prolong his stay in power, which means by staying in phase one and not progressing to phase two, his own political longevity is assured for a longer period. And I don't think, I've been thinking a lot about Trump lately, because Trump is both extremely pro-right-wing Frank of Israel, but he's not really a Zionist, and he also has anti-Semitic tendencies. So there's this strange dance that's going on, and a lot of the behind-the-scenes things I've been hearing, insults towards Netanyahu, things like that from the Trump administration, suggest to me that Trump wants things his way, not necessarily not Netanyahu's way in every way, but keeping in line with what all the other co-panelists have said, that it's all about Trump's personal enrichment, Trump's personal relationships. The idea, building on one of the things that my good friend Nabeel Khoury said, that Arab states are going to invest in non-Palestinians living in Gaza, or what we've been calling in Washington Gaza Lago, is rather ridiculous. And so we have a bunch of ridiculous proposals from all sides. We have perhaps the most expansionist Israel we've seen in 40 years. That has, according to one Israeli minister, I think about 2 months ago, said, "You kill us, we take your territory." So we have an Israel that wants more of Lebanon, more of Syria, more of the West Bank, more of Jerusalem, and more of Gaza, with the settlers lining up outside Gaza at the gates, ready to move in as soon as, Trump and Netanyahu give them the green light. So this is an untenable situation and a bit of an impasse in terms of phase two.
Right, now getting to that point of Arab investment in Gaza, which only adds to the confusion, as you point out, Egypt and Jordan, two countries mentioned by President Trump as being countries that would accept the Palestinians expelled from Gaza, have said no, that is not what they are going to do. Saudi Arabia will lead discussions at an Arab summit that's going to be taking place in early March. What do you expect from the Arab nations in the region?
Not much in terms of concessions towards the Trump position. Of course, it's the Saudi plan that's still the plan on the table. It's a good offer. I know from my interviews...
And just to remind us, the Saudi plan is recognition of Israel in return for two states.
Yeah, it's basically making all kinds of concessions towards previous positions the Arab countries have had towards Israel, including the normalization and all that, in exchange for a Palestinian state, in exchange for peace. And one of the things I've been saying since October 8th is one of the problems here is that with all this discussion of permanent truces and permanent ceasefires, that doesn't exist as a concept in international law. It's called a peace treaty. And neither side in this conflict want a peace treaty. So instead what we're getting is sort of phase two and phase three of something that's not a peace treaty for now. and really no indications of progress towards an eventual peace treaty. So instead, we're hearing about pathways towards a Palestinian state, again, under the Biden plan, which Trump forced Netanyahu to accept, but it's the Biden plan. And not a lot of daylight here, or at least, a lot of things that look like they're likely to happen. Instead, we have Egypt, who will take no one. Jordan, who said they'll take 2,000 injured children, but not much else. And a long history here over 70 years of Arab states being pressured to take Palestinians and refusing. And so what I expect out of the March 4th conference is maybe some concessions on tangential issues, but just a representation with a new bow, of the Arab peace plan, and hopes that to sort of live for another day when serious people will talk about a Palestinian state with political rights and dignity and prosperity for the Palestinians, which they've been long waiting.
Right. Muhannad, Ayyash, we're talking about Gaza, but there's also been Israeli attacks in the occupied West Bank. Palestinians there have been attacked, not only by Israeli military forces, but by illegal colonial settlers who've been attacking Palestinians, destroying their property there. At this stage, we know that 870 Palestinians have been killed. That's since October 7th in 2023. What is your assessment of the situation there right now?
It's quite dire. The Jenin refugee camp, by all accounts, looks exactly the same as some of the neighborhoods in Gaza. It is utterly destroyed, infrastructure completely destroyed, homes demolished, razed to the ground, thousands of people displaced, economy in shatters. It's shattered. It's just a very, very difficult situation for Palestinians in the West Bank. They're under enormous pressure from the Israelis. There's definitely continued and increased settlement activity. The Israeli authorities and the settlers who work together, by the way, and have worked together for years, are being much more brazen in their colonization of Palestinian lands. So we see in these times a clear manifestation in acts, forget the words, in acts, in policies, what the Israeli project is all about. And the Israeli project is all about creating exclusive Israeli Jewish sovereignty from the river to the sea. They don't want a Palestinian state. The Knesset voted on it last year to say no go. It's a quote-unquote existential threat to Israel. They don't want Palestinians living on their lands. They want to create exclusive Israeli Jewish sovereignty across the whole territory, and they want the whole region to bow down and say, yes, okay, we'll accept that, and we'll take in all these refugees, and we'll bow down to you. I mean, this is fanciful thinking, but that is precisely what has guided other colonial projects in the past. Look, the actually ironic thing here is that if Israel were to be satisfied with what they colonized in 1948, which is 78% of historic Palestine, if they were to say, you know what, we're going to stop there, we'll let the Palestinians have just that 22%, cram them into those spaces, we're going to deny them their aspirations to return to the lands from which they were expelled in 1948, we're just going to say 2 states, 1 on 22%, we take 78%, case closed on the right of return, they would right now get Arab normalization, not just from Saudi Arabia. As soon as Saudi Arabia gives it, the rest will follow, and other countries beyond the region would follow as well, and it would effectively end the story. But since they are not willing to do that because they want 100%, we're going to continue to now have the continuing violences and continuing conversations about a different kind of solution because they have killed the two-state solution. So now I think we need to start to have more serious conversations in the international community about a one-state solution, equal rights for all Palestinians and Israelis, and the right of the Palestinians to return to all their lands.
Yossi, Mekelberg, what are your thoughts on what we've just heard Muhannad telling us there, that this is part of what he called the Israeli project, which is the permanent occupation of Palestinian territories? There was a very scathing report from Amnesty International which said that Israel is carrying out unlawful killings in the occupied West Bank. It's denying medical assistance to people who have been injured. So what do you believe is the ultimate goal?
Well, and instead of talking about the Israelis, we should talk about the current Israeli government. And this is no doubt the most far-right Israeli government in the country's history. And yes, there are elements there, no doubt. They want a full annexation of both West Bank and Gaza. They would like to see minimum Palestinian living in both Gaza and the West Bank. This is the current situation. Now, I think we can lament for a very long time all the missed opportunity to reach a two-state solution. We still need to look for some modality of a two-state solution, possibly confederation between the Israelis and the Palestinians. I don't think, even if someone said that in ideal world, one-state solution is the one that gives everyone the same rights, I think it's a pipe dream. It's not going to happen because we don't have any modality of moving from more than 100 years of war into one nation, one state, one constitution, system of governance. What we need is change of government, by the way, in both sides. We need to change the discourse. We need to change it to move first by the end of the war in Gaza, reducing with the intervention of the international community, reducing the tension in the West Bank, scaling back the entrenchment on the occupation, dealing with terrorism there, whether it comes from settlers or come from militant Palestinians. And, you know, both society needs to move from this kind of conversation in conversation of peace. It was just my add one thing. Obviously, the occupier have more responsibility for this situation than the occupied.
Nabeel, Khoury, I'm going to turn now to the other flashpoint in the region, and that is northern Israel, southern Lebanon, on the border there. The deadline for, there's also a ceasefire in place there, and the deadline for Israeli troops to withdraw from southern Lebanon has passed. Israel continues to maintain forces in Lebanon at 5 key points, they say. Is this a direct violation of this ceasefire? I mean, what is your reading of what's going on along the border there?
Well, it's obviously a violation of the ceasefire, and the idea there as well is that Israel has a certain project. Part of the problem with Lebanon is that they want to see, if not the total destruction of Hezbollah, somehow the turning of southern Lebanon into a demilitarized zone, and they would keep these 5 strategic points for watching over that territory and having a friendly, in their view, Lebanese army to fill the gap and therefore guarantee a certain safe zone for them and for the those living, the Israelis living in the northern settlements and cities and villages, to go back to their homes. I don't think they plan to leave those 5 points. They still occupy Sheba farms, by the way, and I don't think they have any plans to leave that strip of land either. So in the end, I think there is there are options here, there are alternatives on the table. They can, at a later date, pull out completely and hope to turn the ceasefire into a peace treaty. But the new Lebanese president and prime minister and cabinet, all of whom have received the endorsement of Washington and Tel Aviv, have issued statements saying their goal is the complete liberation of Lebanese territory. So there are options right now. Israel and the United States have the upper hand as a result of this 16-month war. But things shift in the region. I mean, there is the possibility, even if small, that Saudi Arabia would lead an Arab bloc and use some leverage to change course. Or after a period of regrouping, the axis of resistance will rise again, and we will go back to conflict.
William Lawrence, on this question of a demilitarized zone along the Israeli-Lebanese border, it has been suggested both France and the United States are urging the Israelis to leave South Lebanon. In fact, France has suggested the deployment of French troops or UN troops. There's been other talk of other troops being deployed there. What is likely?
I think what's likely is what Khoury just said,
Yeah.
but to go a little deeper, I always find it interesting that, why do the demilitarized zones always have to be on Arab land? You know, why can't, Israel can demilitarize inside its own country. It can do it around Gaza, it can do it along the Lebanese border, it can do it with Syria. So this idea that they have to demilitarize on Arab territory doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And I think if things are negotiated in a proper format, I'm sure the Lebanese might make some concessions here if the Israelis made some concessions there, but that's not how these negotiations are happening, right? Negotiations are happening with a reluctant far-right Israeli government being forced into concessions by the Trump administration only when the Trump administration sees it in its interest. I think the silver lining here is that the Lebanon policy of the United States is not very good, but the Gaza policy is much, much worse. I mean, the Palestinians have so much less status and so much less concern from the international community, despite the fact that the Americans put a lot of the humanitarian aid into Gaza, which isn't discussed that much. But on Lebanon, the stability of the Lebanese government is seen by the Trump team, you know, the key people, and I've been talking to some other people and trying to figure out who's going to be in what job, because a lot of that's not determined yet. But there's a lot of understanding among Jewish Americans, Israelis, and advisors of Trump that the stability of the Lebanese government is preeminent here, and that depends in part on Israel making concessions we may not see the equality of, you know, when it comes to the Palestinians. So there's a chance here that we could see an outcome that works for Lebanon, because Lebanon matters.
Very quickly, I only got 10 seconds. At some point, is Iran going to have to be involved in these negotiations?
I don't think so, although behind the scenes there's all kinds of things going on. So for example, the Iranians are sending planes and reconstruction, you know, so there's going to be an Iranian role, but whether or not they're involved directly in negotiations, no. On the side, maybe to some understandings with the Iranians.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington.